Hey, what if I told you that everything you've been taught about the serpent in Genesis is wrong? That the story drilled into your head in Sunday school, Bible study, or religious classes is missing the bigger picture? Welcome to The Secret of the Serpent in Genesis. What the Hebrew text reveals will shock. What makes this exploration extraordinary? While countless scholars have analyzed this text over centuries, none have pieced together the complete narrative I'm about to share. We're diving deep into ancient Hebrew linguistics, archaeological findings, and cultural connections that have been overlooked or intentionally ignored for generations. To uncover these revelations, I spent 3 years studying original Hebrew texts, consulting with leading biblical scholars from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and analyzing ancient Near Eastern archaeological records. I've cross-referenced over 200 historical documents, including recently discovered Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that shed new light on this ancient narrative. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this isn't just another Bible story analysis. You'll gain insights that will fundamentally change how you view one of the most misunderstood passages in religious literature. You'll discover how ancient Hebrew wordplay reveals hidden meanings, how neighboring civilizations influenced this narrative, and most importantly, why this new understanding matters for our modern interpretation of wisdom, knowledge, and human consciousness. Part 1. The Divine Whisper: How a single Hebrew word shatters everything we thought we knew about the Garden of Eden. Picture a crisp autumn morning in 1947 at Jerusalem's Hebrew University. In a high-ceilinged room where sunlight filters through dust-stained windows, Professor David Cohen leans over an ancient scroll, his weathered hands trembling slightly as they trace lines of Hebrew text. The room smells of aged parchment and cedar wood from the storage cases. Around him, a team of world-renowned linguists huddles in anxious anticipation. They've spent months analyzing the Dead Sea Scrolls, but today is different. Today, they've stumbled upon something that would challenge 2 millennia of biblical interpretation. The discovery centers on a single word, nachash. As Professor Cohen's magnifying glass hovers over the ancient text, his colleague, Dr. Sarah Levinson, notices something peculiar about the way the word is used in the Genesis narrative. The careful strokes of the Hebrew letters seem to dance with hidden meaning, each curve and line potentially holding centuries of misunderstood significance. This isn't just about a serpent, Dr. Levinson whispers, her voice barely containing her excitement. Look at the contextual patterns, the linguistic connections. This is something far more profound. Let's pause here and dive deeper into what they discovered that morning. The Hebrew language, unlike English, is built on root systems where words sharing the same root often share connected meanings. The root of nachash appears in numerous contexts throughout the ancient texts, each instance adding another layer to its meaning. Consider the story of Balaam in the Book of Numbers. Here we find the same root used when God reveals divine knowledge. The text describes Balaam receiving supernatural insight using the word nachash. This isn't coincidental. It's part of a deliberate pattern woven through the biblical narrative. The ancient authors were masters of such literary techniques, embedding layers of meaning that would have been obvious to their contemporary audiences, but have become obscured by time and translation. In another fascinating connection, we find the word appearing in the story of King Solomon. When Solomon prays for wisdom, the Hebrew text uses terminology closely related to nachash. The connection between serpentine imagery and divine wisdom runs deep through the biblical narrative, appearing in unexpected places that most readers simply pass over. The implications become even more intriguing when we examine the Garden of Eden scene in detail. The text describes the nachash as arum, typically translated as cunning or crafty. But here's where the linguistic artistry becomes apparent. The Hebrew word arum plays off erumim, the term used to describe Adam and Eve's nakedness. This isn't just clever wordplay. It's a sophisticated theological statement about knowledge, awareness, and transformation. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a modern expert in ancient Near Eastern languages, explains it this way. Imagine reading a complex poem where every word has multiple meanings, and those meanings create layers of understanding. That's what we're seeing in the Genesis text. The nachash isn't just a character in the story, it's a literary device that connects. The evidence continues to mount as we examine other ancient texts. In the Dead Sea Scrolls Temple Scroll, the word nachash appears alongside descriptions of celestial beings. In the recently discovered fragments from Qumran Cave 11, it's used in contexts suggesting divine revelation. Each discovery adds another piece to this fascinating puzzle. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source. In 2019, archaeologists uncovered a collection of clay tablets near Jericho containing early Hebrew writings. These tablets, dating back to the 8th century BCE, use the word nachash in a context that explicitly connects it to divine wisdom and transformation. This discovery sent shockwaves through the academic community, forcing scholars to reevaluate their understanding of this ancient text. The implications are profound. If the nachash was understood by its original audience as more than just a serpent, perhaps as a divine being or a messenger of wisdom, how does this change our understanding of the entire Genesis narrative? The traditional interpretation of temptation and fall begins to look more like a story of awakening and transformation. Consider the nachash's famous words to Eve. "Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." In light of the linguistic evidence, these words take on new significance. They're not just temptation, they're a promise of transformation, of elevated consciousness. The Hebrew text reveals layers of meaning that suggest this was never meant to be a simple story of disobedience. Modern scholars like Dr. James Richardson of Columbia University suggests that the nachash represents something far more complex than traditional interpretations allow. When we understand the full linguistic context, he explains, we see a sophisticated theological exploration of human consciousness and divine knowledge. The nachash isn't a villain, it's a catalyst for human development. This brings us to a crucial question. Why has this understanding been lost for so long? The answer lies partly in translation challenges and partly in theological preconceptions that have shaped biblical interpretation for centuries. The rich, multifaceted meaning of nachash has been flattened into a simple noun, losing the depth and complexity of the original Hebrew. But to fully grasp the significance of this linguistic revelation, we need to step beyond the bounds of Hebrew scholarship and into the wider ancient world. The cultures surrounding ancient Israel, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, had their own complex relationships with serpent symbolism. Understanding these cultural connections will help us see how the authors of Genesis were engaging with a much broader conversation about wisdom, divinity, and human potential. Part 2. Sacred Serpents: How Ancient Civilizations Shaped the Biblical Narrative. Let me transport you to the heart of the ancient Near East, where our story takes an unexpected turn. Picture yourself standing in the grand hall of an Egyptian temple, circa 1500 BCE. The air is thick with incense, and towering columns rise like ancient trees toward a ceiling painted with stars. At the temple's entrance, something catches your eye: a magnificent golden cobra, the Oreus, rising from the headdress of a pharaoh's statue. This isn't just decorative art. In Egypt, the serpent represented divine protection and royal power. The uraeus, worn by pharaohs, was believed to spit fire at enemies and symbolize the eye of Ra, the sun god. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, leading Egyptologist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, explains, the Egyptian view of serpents was remarkably sophisticated. They weren't seen as evil creatures, but as manifestations of divine power and wisdom. But our journey doesn't end in Egypt. Let's travel north to ancient Mesopotamia, where an extraordinary discovery was made in 1923 D. In the ruins of an ancient temple in Ur, archaeologists unearthed a cylinder seal depicting the god Enki surrounded by serpents. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, the seal shows him bestowing knowledge upon humanity, a narrative that bears striking parallels to our Genesis story. This connection deepened in 2018 when researchers at Baghdad University uncovered tablets describing Enki's role as a divine mediator who sometimes defied other gods to help humanity. Sound familiar? The parallels to our Genesis serpent are impossible to ignore. The plot thickens as we move to ancient Canaan, the very land where the Hebrew Bible took shape. In 1961, archaeologists excavating at Ugarit discovered something remarkable, a bronze serpent intertwined with an inscription about healing and transformation. This artifact, dated to roughly 1200 BCE, provides crucial context for understanding the biblical serpent. The Great Book of Exodus. Dr. Jonathan Friedman of Harvard University explains, the Canaanites viewed serpents as symbols of healing and renewal. When Moses later created a bronze serpent to heal the Israelites in the wilderness, he was drawing on deeply established cultural symbolism. But perhaps the most startling evidence comes from a recent discovery in Jordan. In 2021, archaeologists uncovered a temple complex dedicated to serpent worship, dating back to the time when the earliest versions of Genesis were being written. The temple walls feature inscriptions describing the serpent as a bearer of divine. Consider this. When the authors of Genesis wrote about the nachash, they weren't writing in a vacuum. They were engaging with a rich tapestry of cultural meanings that their original audience would have instantly recognized. The serpent's role as a wisdom bringer wasn't shocking to ancient readers. It was part of their cultural DNA. This understanding transforms our reading of Genesis 3. When the serpent tells Eve, "Your eyes will be opened," it's invoking a widely understood metaphor for divine enlightenment. The choice of a serpent as the catalyst for human knowledge wasn't arbitrary. It was drawing on centuries of established symbolism. The evidence reaches a crescendo with the discovery of the wisdom tablets in northern Syria in 2019. These ancient texts explicitly connect serpent imagery with the acquisition of divine knowledge, suggesting that this association was widespread throughout the ancient Near East during the formation of the biblical narrative. But this cultural backdrop raises an even more intriguing question. How did this sophisticated understanding of the serpent transform into the simplistic villain we know today? To answer that, we need to examine the fascinating evolution of biblical interpretation through the ages, where we'll discover how political, social, and theological forces gradually reshape this complex symbol into something far more sinister. Part 3. The Dialogue That Changed Humanity. A deep dive into Genesis 3's revolutionary conversation. Picture the Garden of Eden at that pivotal moment before dawn. The air hangs heavy with possibility, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and fresh earth. Dewdrops cling to leaves that have never known decay, in a world where death and suffering remain abstract concepts. The first rays of sunlight filter through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground beneath the tree of knowledge, its fruit hanging ripe and untouched, each one seeming to hold the weight of destiny within its flesh. In this pristine setting, Dr. Rachel Winters of Harvard's Department of Near Eastern Languages explains, we find ourselves witness to what may be the most sophisticated philosophical dialogue in ancient literature. The conversation about to unfold would forever alter the course of human consciousness. Eve walks alone in the garden's morning mist. The Hebrew text describes her movements with careful precision, using words that suggest contemplation rather than aimless wandering. The nachash appears not slithering like a common serpent, but manifesting with a presence that the original Hebrew describes using terms typically reserved for divine encounters. The dialogue begins with what modern scholars recognize as a masterpiece of philosophical inquiry. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The original Hebrew construction, as Dr. James Morton of Oxford's Biblical Studies Department notes, employs a sophisticated rhetorical device known as eroticis, a question designed not to gather information, but to provoke deeper contemplation. Consider the psychological complexity at play. The nachash doesn't launch into accusations or demands. Instead, it creates a space for dialogue, encouraging Eve to articulate and examine the divine prohibition herself. This is not the approach of a deceiver, but rather the method of a teacher, employing what we would now recognize as the Socratic method. Eve's response reveals layers of psychological and theological sophistication that have often been overlooked. She doesn't simply repeat God's command, but expands upon it. We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, "You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die." The addition of touch, a detail absent from God's original prohibition, suggests Eve is already engaged in theological interpretation, already moving beyond simple obedience to active religious thinking. Dr. Sarah Goldstein, leading expert in ancient Near Eastern psychology, points out a fascinating detail in the Hebrew text. Eve's elaboration uses language patterns associated with legal interpretation in other ancient Middle Eastern texts. She's not just repeating a rule, Goldstein explains, she's engaging in the first recorded instance of biblical exegesis. The nachash's famous reply, "You will not certainly die," takes on new significance when we examine the Hebrew construction. The phrase uses a unique grammatical form that suggests not simple contradiction, but rather a more nuanced truth. The literal translation would be, "Dying, you will not die," a construction that hints at transformation rather than mere mortality. The dialogue reaches its philosophical apex with the nachash's next statement, "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." In the original Hebrew, this uses the same verbal root for knowing that appears in intimate human relationships, suggesting not mere intellectual knowledge, but deep, experiential understanding. Here the text provides an extraordinary psychological portrait of Eve's decision-making process. The Hebrew describes three distinct stages of evaluation. She saw that the fruit was good for food, physical consideration, pleasing to the eye, aesthetic judgment, and desirable for gaining wisdom, intellectual/spiritual assessment. This tripartite analysis mirrors ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature's formula for complete understanding. The moment of consumption itself is described with deliberate parallelism that often gets lost in translation. In Hebrew, the text creates a rhythm. She took, she ate, she gave, he ate. Each verb carries equal weight, suggesting not a fall from grace, but a series of conscious choices leading to transformation. The text delivers these actions with the weight of destiny, each verb standing alone, each action irreversible and world-changing. The aftermath reveals perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the entire narrative. When their eyes were opened, the Hebrew word used, pakaha, pakak, is the same term used elsewhere in Scripture to describe prophetic vision. They gain not just awareness of their physical state, but what modern psychologists would recognize as metacognition, the ability to think about thinking itself. The traditional interpretation of God's response as pure punishment begins to unravel when we examine the Hebrew closely. The curses pronounced can be read as consequences rather than punishments, the natural results of elevated consciousness and the burden of knowledge. The pain of childbirth becomes a metaphor for the price of creating new life in a world of consciousness. The toil of work represents the burden of conscious decision-making and planning that separates human agriculture from animal foraging. But to fully grasp the revolutionary nature of this dialogue, we must examine how different religious traditions throughout history have wrestled with its implications. As we'll discover, the interpretations of this conversation have evolved dramatically across time and cultures, each adding new layers of understanding to this ancient tale of consciousness and transformation. Part 4. Through the Prism of Time, How History's Greatest Minds Wrestled with Genesis's Most Enigmatic Figure. Imagine yourself in the Grand Library of Alexandria circa 150 CE. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls lined with thousands of papyrus scrolls. their ancient wisdom waiting to be unveiled. In a secluded corner, illuminated by flickering lamplight, sits Philo Judaeus, one of Judaism's most profound philosophers. His weathered hands trace Hebrew letters on a scroll as he pens words that would challenge religious thought for millennia. The serpent represents not evil, but the dual nature of pleasure, a force that both seduces and enlightens, that both restricts and liberates the human soul. The air is thick with the scent of cedar and aged parchment as Philo elaborates his revolutionary interpretation. In his commentary on the creation, preserved through centuries of careful copying, he argues that the traditional understanding of the serpent misses layers of profound symbolism. Consider, he writes, how the serpent's words prove true. Did humanity not gain knowledge? Did they not become more like the divine? Let's journey deeper into the ancient Jewish world, where the earliest interpretations emerged within the bustling intellectual centers of Jerusalem and Babylon. In the shadow of the Second Temple, amid the political tensions of Roman occupation, Jewish scholars engaged in intense debates about the serpent's true nature. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the Qumran caves, reveal a document that would shake traditional interpretations to their core. Known as the Life of Adam and Eve, this text describes the serpent in terms that would seem heretical to later readers. "And the serpent appeared," it reads, "shining with a light that rivaled the sun, speaking words of wisdom that opened the gates of understanding." Dr. Rachel Goldstein of Columbia University notes that this description uses the same Hebrew terms typically reserved for angelic beings, suggesting the ancient authors saw the serpent as a divine messenger rather than a demonic tempter. The narrative takes an even more fascinating turn when we examine the Talmudic debates. Picture the great Academy of Sura in Babylon around 300 CE. Here, amid the hume of scholarly discourse, Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish engaged in a debate that would echo through centuries. The marble halls rang with their intellectual sparring as they dissected every nuance of the serpent's appearance and role. "The serpent walked upright like a man," declared Rabbi Yochanan, his voice carrying across the crowded study hall. "It possessed wisdom surpassing that of all other creatures." Resh Lakish countered with an even more radical interpretation. The serpent was no mere creature, but a manifestation of divine wisdom itself, sent to awaken humanity from its childlike state. As we move into the early Christian era, the interpretations become even more diverse and dramatic. In 2nd century Alexandria, a thriving community of Christian Gnostics met in secret underground chambers, their walls adorned with mysterious symbols. Here, by the light of oil lamps, they shared an interpretation that would later be branded as heresy. The serpent was humanity's true benefactor. The Gnostic text, Testimony of Truth, discovered in 1945 Aimang, the Nag Hammadi Library, presents a stunning reversal of the traditional narrative. The serpent, it declares, was wiser than all other beings. It understood that the Creator who forbade knowledge was not the true God, but a lesser being who sought to keep humanity in ignorance. Dr. Michael Bradford, expert in early Christian texts at Yale Divinity School, explains the revolutionary nature of this interpretation. The Gnostics saw the serpent as a liberator, a Prometheus-like figure who dared to bring divine knowledge to humanity despite the consequences. This completely inverts the traditional understanding of the Genesis narrative. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Christian tradition, scholars were developing their own unique interpretations. Origen of Alexandria, working in his seaside study as Mediterranean waves crashed against the shore, proposed a psychological reading that was centuries ahead of its time. In his masterwork First Principles, he suggested the serpent represented the internal dialogue within every human soul. Not an external tempter, but the voice of emerging consciousness itself. But perhaps the most profound interpretations emerged from the mystical Jewish tradition of Kabbalah. Picture a candle-lit study house in 13th century Spain, where Rabbi Moses de Leon penned the Zohar, Kabbalah's masterpiece. The air thick with incense, He wrote of the serpent as the essential force of growth and transformation, without which the universe would remain static and humanity would never achieve its divine potential. The Zohar presents the serpent as a necessary aspect of creation itself, the force that introduces complexity and choice into an otherwise simple world. Just as a pearl cannot form without an irritant within the oyster, it teaches, so too human consciousness could not evolve without the catalyst of the serpent's wisdom. What if our modern understanding of this ancient tale has been unnecessarily limited? As we reach the end of this profound journey through one of history's most misunderstood narratives, I want to leave you with a thought that might challenge everything you've believed about this ancient text. What if the story of the serpent in Genesis isn't about humanity's fall at all, but rather about our first step toward consciousness, toward understanding, toward becoming truly human? Think about it. Every major revelation about the nachash, from the complex Hebrew linguistics to the ancient Near Eastern symbolism, from early Jewish wisdom to Gnostic interpretations, points to something far more profound than a simple tale of temptation and sin. We're looking at a sophisticated narrative about the awakening of human consciousness, about our species' first steps toward understanding both good and evil, about the price and privilege of knowledge itself. This raises some provocative questions. What if the traditional interpretation of the serpent as a deceiver was itself the greatest deception? What if this ancient story holds crucial insights about human consciousness that we're only now beginning to understand? And perhaps most importantly, what does this mean for how we view knowledge, wisdom, and the human potential for transformation? I want to hear your thoughts on this. How does this new understanding of the serpent change your perspective on the Genesis narrative? What aspects of this interpretation resonate with your own spiritual or philosophical journey? Share your insights in the comments below. I personally read and respond to as many comments as possible, and I'm fascinated to hear your perspective on this revolutionary interpretation. Look, if this exploration has opened your eyes to new possibilities in biblical interpretation, consider subscribing to this channel. We dive deep into ancient texts, uncover hidden meanings, and challenge traditional interpretations every week. Hit that subscribe button and bell icon to join our community of truth seekers and critical thinkers. And here's a challenge for you. Share this video with someone who thinks they know the Genesis story. Whether they agree or disagree with this interpretation, I guarantee it will spark a fascinating conversation about consciousness, knowledge, and human potential. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of humanity's most profound and misunderstood stories. Remember, as the nachash itself might say, sometimes the path to wisdom requires us to question what we think we know. Stay curious, keep questioning, and I'll see you in our next exploration of ancient wisdom.